It was late autumn of 1994 when I decided to spend a few days at my uncle's old farm cabin in southern Iowa. He had passed away the year before, and the property had been sitting untouched since. My mother kept telling me to go there and take a look at what was left before the place completely fell apart. The drive from Des Moines took almost 4 hours, most of it on cracked 2-lane roads that cut through empty fields and quiet little towns where gas stations looked like they hadn't seen business in weeks. By the time I reached the long dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was already dipping low, turning the sky orange and gold. The road stretched between dry cornfields, their stalks dead and leaning in the wind. It looked like no one had driven through there in years. Grass grew through the middle of the path, and there were deep ruts filled with rainwater. I drove slow, feeling the car bump and slide in the mud. When the cabin finally came into view, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. It was smaller than I remembered, just a single floor with a rusted tin roof, paint peeled off the wooden walls, and windows clouded with dirt. Behind it was a small barn, half collapsed on one side, its red paint faded to brown. The place looked lifeless, forgotten. I parked beside the cabin and stepped out. The air smelled of damp soil and rotting leaves. There was a faint buzzing sound coming from the fields, the kind of hum that fills the air when insects are thick, though I didn't see any. The wind made the dry corn stalks whisper and shift, and the sound echoed faintly across the open land. The front door stuck when I tried to open it. I had to push hard before it gave way, and a cloud of dust rose in the air. The smell hit me immediately: stale wood, mold, and something faintly metallic, like rust. Inside, the place looked like time had frozen. A few old coats hung by the door. The kitchen table still had a cracked coffee mug on it. A faded calendar on the wall said, September 1989. I spent the first hour just walking around, looking through everything. The floor creaked under every step. In the bedroom, the bed was still made, though the sheets were yellowed and stiff. There was a small shelf with a few books, their pages swollen from moisture. The bathroom sink was rusted, and when I tried the faucet, nothing came out. I decided I'd sleep in the main room near the old fireplace. I brought a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and some canned food. The electricity didn't work, which wasn't a surprise. I had a small lantern that gave off a weak yellow light, barely enough to push back the darkness that crept in from every corner once night came. The first night wasn't terrible, just cold. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the roof when it shifted. The only sound that bothered me was something faint, like a scraping or dragging noise outside. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably a branch against the barn or maybe an animal moving through the field. Still, it kept me awake for hours. In the morning, I went out to check around. The ground was soft from last night's rain. I noticed prints near the side of the barn, deep marks in the mud, not quite boot prints, but definitely human. They weren't fresh, maybe a few days old, but still visible. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone from the nearby town had come by to look around. Inside the barn, it smelled of dust and rotting hay. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, lighting up clouds of dust. There were a few old tools hanging on the wall, rusted saws, shovels, a broken lantern. In the corner was an old freezer chest. It wasn't plugged in, but there were scratch marks all over the top, like someone had dragged something across it. I lifted the lid, half expecting to find a dead animal, but it was empty except for a layer of dirt and mouse droppings. That night, the noises started again, only louder. It sounded like something scraping against the wall outside. Then came a soft thump, followed by another and another, as if someone was slowly circling the cabin. I turned off the lantern and sat still in the dark, trying to listen. The wind had stopped completely. There was only that faint rhythmic sound, slow and deliberate. I stayed awake most of the night, my body tense, heart beating fast. When dawn finally came, I went outside again. The air was colder, and there was a mist covering the ground. I walked around the cabin, checking the walls. On the back side, near the window, there were fresh marks. Long scratches in the wood, deep and uneven. They looked like they'd been made by metal, not an animal. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel that something wasn't right. The feeling stayed with me all morning. Around noon, I went out toward the far end of the property, near the tree line, where an old wire fence still stood. Beyond it was another stretch of farmland that had been empty for years. I noticed something odd there, an old blue tarp caught in the brush. When I pulled it loose, I found a pile of old tools underneath it, covered in dried mud. Most of them looked broken, but one, a heavy hammer, had dark stains along the handle. I dropped it back down and walked away. By the third night, I didn't want to stay anymore, but my car battery had died sometime during the day. I must have left the lights on without realizing it. The nearest town was nearly 10 miles away, and there was no signal on my phone. I decided I'd walk to town at sunrise. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard movement again. This time closer, right against the window. I didn't move. The scraping started again, followed by a faint rattle of the doorknob. I felt my whole body tense up. It wasn't the wind this time. Someone was outside. I reached for the small hatchet I'd found in the barn earlier and sat there in silence, barely breathing. The noise went on for a few minutes, then stopped. Everything went quiet again, except for the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. When morning finally came, I opened the door slowly. On the porch, there was a small piece of fabric caught on a nail, a strip of dark flannel, like from an old shirt. The mud near the steps was disturbed again, deep footprints leading off toward the barn. I followed them, though every step made my stomach tighten. The barn door was slightly open. Inside, it was darker than before. The air felt heavier. I could smell something rotten, faint but sharp. I saw the freezer chest again, still closed. The scratch marks on top looked newer. I walked closer, and that's when I saw it, the lock. Someone had added a new padlock to the side overnight. It wasn't there before. I backed away slowly and left the barn. I didn't care what was inside anymore. I packed my things, grabbed what I could carry, and started walking down the dirt road toward the main highway. The whole way, I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone following, but there was no one. When I finally reached the main road, I managed to flag down a farmer in an old pickup truck. He gave me a lift into town. I didn't tell him much, just that my car broke down and I needed a mechanic. A few days later, when I went back with a tow truck to get my car, I noticed something strange. The cabin door was wide open. The inside looked like it had been ransacked. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered, furniture knocked over. But the barn was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, just gone. There was only a flat patch of dirt where it had been, like it had never existed. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. The ground looked freshly leveled. The soil turned over. No tire tracks, no machinery marks, nothing. I felt a chill crawl up my back. I never found out what happened there or who had been coming around those nights. The county records showed that no one had been on that property in years, and no permits were ever filed for demolition. I sold the land a month later to some company that planned to clear it for crops. Sometimes, though, when I drive through that part of Iowa, I take a detour just to pass by that road. The fields are empty now, nothing left but grass and dirt. But every time, I swear I can still see the outline of that cabin in the distance, just faint enough to make me doubt my own memory, like something that refuses to fade, even after being buried. It was the middle of autumn in 2015 when I rented a small cabin in northern England, somewhere deep in the Lake District. I had found it online, a short-term listing owned by an older man who claimed it was a peaceful retreat, surrounded by woods and far from traffic or neighbors. I'd taken a month off work and wanted to get away from people, from noise, from everything. I just wanted quiet, and that cabin seemed like the right place for it. The drive there took nearly 6 hours, and as the narrow roads wound deeper into the countryside, I noticed how empty the place felt. Miles of trees, wet dirt paths, and scattered stone cottages that looked like no one had lived in them for years. When I arrived, the cabin stood near the base of a small hill. It was smaller than the pictures made it seem. Dark wood, one window in front, and a single chimney that leaned slightly to the left. The inside smelled faintly of damp wood and something like old fabric, the kind of scent that sticks to furniture after years of not being aired out. It wasn't fancy, but it had what I needed: a small kitchen, a table, a bed, and a stove that used firewood. The first 2 days were quiet. The rain didn't stop, and most of the time I just stayed inside reading or writing in my notebook. The only sounds were the soft dripping from the trees and the occasional creak of the roof when the wind picked up. At night, the forest went completely dark. No lights from nearby homes, no cars, nothing. Just darkness so thick that when I looked out the window, I could only see my own reflection. By the third night, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. Small details at first. My firewood pile seemed lower than I remembered. My boots, which I always left by the door, had been turned around, facing the wall instead of outward. I thought maybe I was just being forgetful. Maybe I'd done it myself without realizing. But then, on the 5th night, I saw her. It was around midnight. The rain had stopped, and I couldn't sleep. I sat by the small window, staring out at the dark woods. The moonlight cut through the trees, pale and weak, but enough to see movement if something passed through. That's when I noticed a faint shape near the tree line. It was a woman standing still among the trees. At first, I thought it might have been a trick of light, maybe the moon hitting a branch or an uneven shadow. But she didn't move for several minutes, just stood there, facing the cabin. Her shape was thin and tall, and her clothes looked dark, like she was wearing a long coat or a dress that reached the ground. I couldn't make out her face clearly because her head was slightly tilted downward, like she was staring at something in front of her. I told myself it was probably someone from a nearby house, maybe lost or looking for help, but that didn't make sense. There were no nearby houses. The nearest village was at least 15 miles away. I turned away from the window for a few seconds, trying to shake it off, and when I looked again, she was gone. The trees looked normal again, the same as before. I told myself I was just tired. Maybe I'd imagined her. I forced myself to go to bed, but I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside, every twig snap or gust of wind, made me open my eyes again. The next morning, I walked outside to clear my head. The ground was wet from the rain, soft and muddy. That's when I saw the footprints. They were clear, leading from the edge of the woods straight toward the cabin. They stopped only a few meters from my window. The shape was small, like a woman's shoe, not boots or hiking shoes. Just one set, leading to the window, not back to the forest. That was the first moment I felt actual fear. I didn't see anyone around. I looked for hours, walking up and down the muddy path, but there were no signs of anyone else nearby. That night, I moved one of the chairs against the door before going to bed. I laughed at myself for doing it, but it gave me a small bit of comfort. The nights that followed were worse. I started hearing faint noises outside the cabin, especially after midnight. A slow, dragging sound, like someone's feet brushing against leaves. Once, I woke up to a soft tapping sound near the window. It wasn't strong, more like a gentle tap every few seconds. I didn't get up. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling until it stopped. After that, I began noticing little things inside. My jacket had been moved from the chair to the floor one morning. My food supplies, a few cans and dry items, were slightly rearranged, like someone had looked through them. I started keeping a knife near my bed, not because I thought I'd use it, but because it made me feel safer having it close. About 2 weeks in, I decided to leave earlier than planned. I had this constant feeling of being watched, even during the day. Every time I went outside, I felt eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. The forest seemed to have gone quiet. No birds, no rustling, just silence. I packed up slowly that morning, trying not to rush, but my hands were shaking as I did. Before leaving, I went outside one last time to gather the last bit of firewood I had stacked behind the cabin. That's when I saw her again, this time closer. She was standing between two birch trees, not more than 30 meters away. Her coat looked wet and torn near the bottom. Her hair hung down, soaked and stringy, almost blending with the dark fabric she wore. Her head was tilted again, the same way as before, and even though I couldn't see her face clearly, I knew she was looking at me. I froze. I didn't move for at least a minute. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I wanted to shout something, but no sound came out. She didn't move, just stood there. Then, without turning, she stepped backward, one slow step after another, and faded into the woods until I couldn't see her anymore. I didn't go after her. I didn't even go back for the wood. I went straight inside, grabbed my bag, and got in the car. The drive out was the longest of my life. The road looked different in daylight, narrower, rougher. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see her standing on the side of the road, but I never did. When I finally reached the main road and saw another car, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly made me cry. I didn't stop driving until I reached Manchester that evening. I stayed in a hotel that night, double-checked the locks, and didn't sleep much. A week later, I got a call from the owner of the cabin. He asked if everything had been fine and if I'd left the back door unlocked. I told him I hadn't used the back door once. He said when he came to check after I left, the door was wide open and a few of his tools from the shed were missing. I never told him what I saw. I didn't tell anyone, really, but sometimes, even now, I think about that woman. The way she stood there so still, so silent. I wonder if she lived somewhere in those woods. Maybe someone who had gone unnoticed for years. Maybe she watched that cabin often, waiting for whoever stayed there to leave. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that. I know what I saw was real flesh and blood. Someone who had been there right outside my window watching me. And when I remember those footprints that ended just below the window, I realize something that still makes my skin crawl. She didn't walk back into the woods that night. She must have stayed there waiting until morning. It was the fall of 1998 when I took a temporary caretaker job outside of Elkins, West Virginia. I was 31 at the time, recently divorced, and trying to get away from city noise and people altogether. The job was simple on paper. Look after an old graveyard on the edge of a small patch of forest, keep it maintained, and stay in the cabin built near it. The pay wasn't great, but I didn't care. I wanted quiet. I wanted space to breathe. The graveyard was about 2 acres wide, fenced with rusted black iron bars that leaned in some places. The headstones were old, most from the late 1800s to early 1900s, gray and chipped, some sinking into the dirt. The cabin stood about 60 yards away, sitting half buried into a slight hill, its wood darkened from rain and age. It had one room, a small stove, and a cot that looked like it had been there for decades. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the place smelled of dry wood, dust, and faint mildew. The first few days went fine. My job was cutting the overgrown grass, trimming weeds around the stones, and making sure no one came through at night. The nearest house was 2 miles away, down a dirt road that twisted through the trees. The only sounds I heard most nights were crickets, the low hoot of an owl, and the wind moving through the forest. But by the fifth night, I started noticing things that bothered me. Not supernatural things, just strange human things. It started with the footprints. One morning, after heavy rain, I saw a set of muddy boot prints coming from the gate and weaving between the rows of headstones. I thought maybe some teenagers had come through at night. But what unsettled me was that the prints didn't go back toward the gate. They stopped behind a larger grave marker, then vanished. I looked around for a while, but the ground beyond that point was soft and untouched. That night, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints. I sat on the cabin's small porch with my flashlight off, looking out toward the graveyard. There was no light there, just blackness and the faint outline of the iron gate. Every few minutes I thought I saw a movement, but it could have just been branches shifting in the wind. Around 2 a.m., I went back inside, shut the door, and bolted it. The bolt was old, but it worked. The next morning, I found the gate wide open. The lock was still on it, hanging loosely, unbroken. I checked it twice the night before. The wind couldn't have done that. It was a heavy iron gate, and it dragged against the ground when it moved. I closed it again and locked it tighter this time. I told myself maybe I hadn't latched it properly. But from that day, I started keeping my flashlight by my side all the time. After a week, I started hearing noises at night. They weren't animal sounds. It was something else, soft metallic clinks, like something brushing against the gate. Sometimes it sounded like faint footsteps on gravel, just far enough that I couldn't tell if they were real. I tried ignoring them, telling myself it was just my imagination working overtime in the dark. One night, a sound woke me up, a short, sharp clang, like metal hitting metal. I sat up on the cot, holding my flashlight. It was cold inside the cabin, colder than usual. The sound came again, this time closer, maybe 10 or 20 yards away. I pointed the light at the window, but the glass was so fogged I couldn't see outside. I didn't move for several minutes. Eventually, I stood and went to the door. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking loud enough to make my chest tighten. The air outside was damp, and a low mist had settled over the graveyard. I could barely make out the headstones through it. I listened. There was nothing. No wind, no animals, just complete stillness. Then, from the far left side of the graveyard, I heard a faint scraping noise, slow and steady, like someone dragging something metal across the dirt. I froze. My flashlight beam shook in my hand as I tried to find the source. It took me a few seconds to see it. A small glint of metal catching the light behind one of the bigger headstones near the back. I thought maybe someone was stealing the old fence iron or one of the metal grave markers. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to walk toward it. The grass brushed against my jeans, wet and cold. When I got closer, the sound stopped. I aimed the flashlight behind the stone. Nothing, just soft dirt and dead leaves. No footprints this time, no movement. I stayed there a while, waiting, but it was silent again. When I finally turned back, I noticed something I hadn't before. The gate was open again, wide open. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lantern burning until morning. By the second week, I was starting to dread the nights. I checked the locks 3 or 4 times before lying down, but I barely slept. During the day, I'd find small changes in the graveyard. Fresh dirt around old graves, stones that had been shifted slightly, twigs laid neatly in lines. I told myself it could be animals or maybe the ground settling, but deep down I didn't believe it. One morning, after a long rain, I found something that made me seriously consider quitting. Near the middle of the graveyard, where the older stones leaned together, someone had dug into the dirt. Not deep, maybe a foot or 2, but fresh, wet soil piled on both sides. It wasn't animal digging. It was too neat, too deliberate. I filled it back in and stood there for a long time, trying to understand why anyone would come here to do that. That night, I stayed awake again, sitting on the porch with my flashlight off. Around midnight, I saw something move in the mist. It was faint, low to the ground, not walking upright. I couldn't tell what it was. It moved slowly between the headstones, stopping now and then. I watched it for nearly 10 minutes, my eyes burning from not blinking. Then it disappeared behind a tree near the back of the graveyard. At dawn, I walked out there. The grass was bent where something had crawled or dragged itself. I followed the path to the tree. Behind it, half hidden under roots, was a small, weathered wooden box. I pulled it out. It looked like an old keepsake chest, dark with moisture. The latch rusted shut. I didn't open it there. I brought it to the cabin, set it on the table, and just stared at it. For hours, I couldn't decide what to do. My stomach turned every time I looked at it. Around noon, I finally pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside were small bones, maybe animal, maybe not. They were arranged in rows, and on top of them was a single rusted metal tag, the kind used for marking graves. The name on it was almost unreadable, worn smooth by time. Only the year was visible, 1904. I didn't touch anything else. I took the box outside, carried it to the edge of the graveyard, and buried it again near the same tree. I didn't want to think about who put it there or why. That evening, I packed my things. I didn't even wait for my paycheck. As I loaded my bags into the truck, I noticed the gate again. It was closed this time, locked tight, even though I hadn't touched it since morning. When I drove off, the road was empty and the trees thick on both sides. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror until the cabin was gone from sight. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I called the small property office that managed the graveyard. The woman there told me the caretaker before me had quit without notice 2 months earlier. She said he never explained why, just left the keys and drove away. I didn't tell her about the box or the sounds. I didn't tell anyone. But sometimes, when I think about that place, I can still picture that mist-covered field, the half-buried stones, and the open gate swaying in the dark without a sound. And what stays with me most isn't what I saw. It's what I felt standing there in the cold, realizing that whatever had been moving through that graveyard at night wasn't gone when I left. It was just waiting for the next caretaker. It had been almost 20 years since I last saw my grandmother's old cabin. She passed away when I was 16, and after her death, nobody really went back there. My father sold off most of the surrounding land, but the cabin sat untouched, hidden deep in the woods like something time forgot. It wasn't anything special, just a small wooden place my grandfather built himself in the 1960s, before I was even born. But it held a strange weight in my memory. The smell of the pine walls, the creak of the floorboards, the way the forest always seemed to swallow sound completely. When I decided to go back there last fall, I told myself it was just for a few days, just to clean it up, see what was left. I didn't expect what I actually found. The drive there took longer than I remembered. The dirt road had almost disappeared, eaten by weeds and fallen branches. My dog, Max, sat in the passenger seat, restless and alert. The trees closed in tighter as I went deeper, tall pines bending over the narrow path like they were trying to hide the place. The air felt heavy even with the windows open. When I finally saw the cabin, it was almost hard to recognize. The paint had peeled off completely, and the front steps were half sunk into the ground. The windows were fogged with grime, and the roof had started to sag in the middle. I parked a few yards away because the ground was soft, soaked from rain the night before. As I stepped out, the smell hit me first. Damp wood, mold, and that stale odor that old places always have. Max stayed close to me, tail low, nose twitching. He was never like that, but I figured it was just the scent of wild animals around. Inside, it looked exactly how I remembered, only older. The furniture was still there, the same old rocking chair by the window, the same rug with the faded floral pattern. Dust coated everything. The air was thick, almost like it hadn't moved in years. I opened a few windows to let in light and air, but even that didn't seem to help much. I spent most of the afternoon sweeping, moving furniture around, and checking for leaks. There were a few mouse droppings and spider webs in every corner. Still, it was just a cabin, nothing out of the ordinary. When evening came, I lit a small fire in the old stone fireplace. The crackling made the silence easier to handle. I cooked a simple meal and ate quietly while Max slept near the door. It was strange being there alone after so long. Every creak and pop from the wood made me glance up. I told myself I was being stupid, just adjusting to the isolation. Around 10, I went to the small bedroom at the back. The sheets were stiff with dust, so I laid my sleeping bag on top. I slept lightly that first night. I woke up a few times to the sound of dripping water or branches brushing against the windows. Around 3 in the morning, Max started growling, deep, low, and steady. I sat up, heart pounding. He was staring toward the far corner of the cabin, near the kitchen. I listened hard but heard nothing but the faint ticking of the cooling fireplace. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the room. Nothing moved. I thought maybe it was a raccoon outside or a squirrel in the roof. Max didn't settle right away, though. He kept his eyes on that corner for a long time before finally lying down again. I didn't get much sleep after that. The next morning was cold and gray. I made coffee on the small stove and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. I decided to check around the outside, make sure no animals had gotten under the cabin. The ground behind it dipped slightly toward the woods. That's where I noticed something strange. A section of dirt that looked disturbed, like it had been dug up at some point and then covered again. It wasn't fresh, but it stood out. The soil was packed differently, and there were bits of old wood poking through. I thought maybe an animal had buried something, or maybe the ground had just shifted from years of rain. Still, it bothered me. By noon, the sky turned darker, and it started raining. I stayed inside, sorting through some of the boxes left in the corner. Most of it was junk, old clothes, letters, yellowed newspapers. But at the very bottom of one box, I found a small metal tin, rusted and dented. Inside were a few photographs, black and white, most of them blurry. They looked like they were taken around the cabin decades ago. In one photo, I could see my grandmother standing near the back steps, smiling, with a man beside her who wasn't my grandfather. I didn't recognize him. The back of the photo had a faint date written in pencil, 1971. There were a few others of the same man, always near the cabin, sometimes standing by the trees. It made me uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, the rain came harder. The sound on the roof was almost deafening. The power was long gone, so I used a lantern. Max refused to leave my side, even when I went to get firewood from the porch. Around midnight, he started pacing again, nose pointed toward the back door. I felt that same crawling tension under my skin. I grabbed the lantern and decided to check the outside, just to calm my nerves. The rain had eased a little, but the ground was slick with mud. I went around the back, light swinging in my hand. The disturbed patch of earth I'd noticed before looked darker now. The soil sunken deeper than before, like it had collapsed inward slightly. I crouched to take a closer look and saw part of a wooden board sticking out, just barely. The rain was washing more of the dirt away. My stomach tightened. It didn't look like just some random buried junk anymore. I went back inside, grabbed the small shovel from near the fireplace, and returned. My hands were shaking a little, but I started digging anyway, just to see what it was. The more dirt I moved, the stronger the smell became. Wet, sour, and unmistakable. Something was rotting down there. I wanted to stop, but something made me keep going. After a few minutes, the edge of the board gave way, revealing fabric underneath, faded and dirty. I thought maybe it was an old blanket or tarp, but then I saw the shape beneath it. A curve that looked too much like a shoulder, a hand half buried in mud. I stumbled back, dropping the shovel. I couldn't breathe for a moment. The rain kept falling, washing thin streams of mud down the hole, slowly uncovering more. It was a body. Old, probably there for decades, bones and rotted clothing barely holding shape. The smell hit me harder now, thick and sickly. I stood there for a long time, not sure what to do. My mind was racing. It didn't make sense. My grandmother had lived here most of her life. I remembered her sitting by the window, reading, humming to herself. I couldn't imagine her being part of something like this. But that man in the photo, the one who wasn't my grandfather, his face came back into my mind. The way he stood next to her like he belonged there. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire with Max beside me, listening to the rain and trying not to think about the thing buried out there. By morning, I decided to call the police as soon as I got back into town. There was no cell service out there, and the road had turned to mud overnight. I had to wait for it to dry a little before I could even drive out. Before leaving, I took one last look around the cabin. The photos were still spread out on the table, that man's face staring up at me. The more I looked, the more I realized something. His clothes, the watch on his wrist, the old hat. It was the same style as the bits of fabric I'd seen in the dirt. It matched. When I finally made it out of the woods, the first thing I did was stop at the sheriff's office. They sent a team out there that same day. Later, one of them called to tell me what they'd found. The body was indeed a man, buried maybe 50 years ago. They found an old pocket watch with initials carved into it, but time and weather had erased most of the evidence. They said there was no record of any missing person from that period matching the clues. It would probably stay unsolved. I sold the property not long after. I couldn't bring myself to go back there again. Some nights, though, when it's raining, I think about that small patch of earth behind the cabin. I think about my grandmother smiling in that old photo, standing beside a man no one ever talked about. And I can't help but wonder how long that body had been there before anyone noticed, and what else those quiet woods had buried with it. It had been almost 3 years since I'd last seen that cabin. 3 years since the divorce papers were signed, and I swore I'd never step foot near that part of the woods again. But life has a way of cornering you, forcing you to face things you thought you'd buried for good. My ex-husband, Mark, had passed away 2 months earlier. Heart attack, they said. He was only 43. We hadn't spoken in years, but when the lawyer called and told me I was still listed as the secondary beneficiary for some property he left behind, I had to deal with it. That property was the cabin, the one he built with his own hands back when we thought our marriage would last forever. It was late September, the air heavy with that damp chill that comes before autumn really settles in. The drive to the cabin took almost 4 hours from my apartment in Cedarville. I'd forgotten how winding the old forest road was, how it dipped and curved between thick pine and dead branches that clawed at the windshield when you got too close. The deeper I went, the weaker the phone signal became, until it disappeared entirely. It was just me, the old truck, and the sound of the tires crushing gravel. When I finally reached the clearing, I almost didn't recognize the place. The grass had grown tall and wild, swallowing parts of the gravel driveway. The roof looked darker than I remembered, the edges sagging slightly. Moss crawled up the sides of the walls like the forest had been trying to take it back. The windows were clouded, and the front porch was littered with pine needles and broken twigs. It looked abandoned, forgotten, like the man who used to live there had been erased from it completely. I parked and sat there for a few minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the place that used to be home. The silence outside was thick. No birds, no wind, just the faint ticking of the cooling engine. I took a deep breath and stepped out. The air smelled of wet wood and old leaves. Every step toward the cabin made me more aware of how alone I was out there. The front door was unlocked, creaked open, slow and heavy. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Dust, damp wood, and something faintly metallic, like rust. Sunlight came in through the dirty windows, casting dull stripes across the floor. Everything was just as he'd left it, but older, grayer. The couch was covered with a thin layer of dust. The table still had a cracked mug on it, the same one he used every morning. I walked through each room carefully, almost afraid to disturb anything. The kitchen was small, with open shelves that held chipped plates and half-used spices. There was still a jar of coffee grounds sitting on the counter, dried and hardened. In the bedroom, the bed was unmade, and the closet door hung open, revealing a few old shirts and a pair of muddy boots. On the dresser sat a framed photo of us from years ago, both smiling, younger, unaware of what would come later. I turned it face down. There was a quiet unease in that cabin that I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear, not yet, but something deeper, like being watched by the weight of old memories. I went back outside to unload my bag and check around the property. Behind the cabin was a small shed Mark had built for tools. The door was swollen shut from moisture, but I managed to pull it open. Inside were rusted gardening tools, an old gas can, and a stack of firewood. A mouse darted out from under a tarp, making me jump. I decided to stay the night. The lawyer had said I needed to check the place, make sure it was stable enough to list for sale. One night would be enough. I swept the floor, lit a few candles I'd brought with me, and tried to make the place feel less hollow. When the sun began to set, the woods around the cabin turned darker than I remembered. The trees stood like tall black pillars, their branches swaying against the fading sky. By the time it was fully dark, the silence outside felt heavier. I sat near the small wood stove, feeding it with a few logs I found behind the shed. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with warmth and flickering shadows. I tried to read a book I brought, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. Every sound made me tense. A branch snapping, leaves shifting, the wind brushing against the side of the house. Around midnight, the rain started, came down in steady sheets, tapping on the metal roof. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The storm grew louder, wind pushing against the walls, rattling the shutters. Then I heard something else. A thud came from outside near the shed. My first thought was that a tree branch had fallen, maybe knocked something over. But then there was another sound, softer this time, like something dragging across the ground. I stood up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. The rain blurred everything. I could barely make out the shape of the shed in the darkness. The flashlight I brought was sitting on the counter, so I grabbed it and stepped outside. The rain hit hard and cold against my jacket. My boots sank into the wet ground as I made my way toward the noise. The shed door was open now. I knew I'd closed it earlier. I shone the light inside, the beam cutting through the rain and landing on the floor. The gas can was tipped over, spilling a thin line of dark liquid across the dirt. The tools had shifted, one of the shovels lying at an odd angle. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was no reason for it to open on its own. The latch was stiff, hard to move even with force. I stood there for a moment, just listening to the rain and my own breathing. Then, behind me, a faint crunch, like a footstep in wet leaves. I turned the flashlight around fast, but there was nothing, just the endless black of the woods, the rain falling in steady lines. My pulse hammered in my ears. I told myself it was an animal. It had to be, maybe a deer or a raccoon looking for shelter. Still, I went back inside and locked the door this time. The rest of the night was long and sleepless. The rain went on for hours, and every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. Around 3 in the morning, the power flickered once and went out completely. The fire in the stove had burned low, and the cabin was swallowed in near total darkness. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about the shed or the sounds outside. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest dripping and gray. I went out again, this time in daylight, to check the shed one last time. The door was still shut. No footprints, no signs of animals. The gas can was upright, like it had never been moved. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it all, if the combination of storm and exhaustion had played tricks on me. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't before. Near the side of the shed, half buried in the mud, it was a small, flat piece of wood, part of an old crate maybe, with faint letters carved into it. I brushed away the dirt. It read MH 2014. Those were Mark's initials. 2014, the year we built the cabin together. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. I couldn't tell if he had left it there on purpose, or if it had just surfaced after the rain. Either way, it felt like something final, a quiet reminder of who he was before everything went wrong. I didn't feel scared anymore, just tired, hollow. I packed up that afternoon. Before I left, I took one last look around the cabin. The fire had gone cold, the air still smelled like wet wood, and the photograph on the dresser still lay face down. I didn't turn it back up. I locked the door behind me, walked to the truck, and started the engine. As I drove down the narrow road, the cabin faded in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely behind the trees. I didn't look back again. Whatever had happened out there, whether it was just my nerves, the weather, or something I'll never really understand, I knew that place wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the past, to a life I'd already left behind. By the time I reached the main road, the sky had cleared. The sun was out, warming the wet pavement. I rolled the window down, breathed in the cold air, and kept driving until the forest was nothing but a shadow in the distance. I never went back. It was late October of 1998 when I decided to take a week off work and drive up to an old cabin my uncle left behind near the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. The place hadn't been used in years, and I wanted a break from everything. Phones, people, city noise. I had just turned 34, and I felt older than that. I packed up my old Ford pickup with a week's worth of food, a few gallons of water, and my dog, a black Labrador named Scout. The drive took nearly 6 hours from Missoula, most of it along narrow mountain roads where the trees seemed to lean inward, their shadows cutting across the windshield like black bars. When I finally reached the turnoff that led to the cabin, the sky was already gray and heavy with clouds. The dirt road was barely visible, swallowed up by overgrown weeds and pine needles. The air smelled damp, sharp with the scent of pine and wet earth. My tires cracked over small rocks and branches as I followed the winding path. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no distant hum of cars, just the sound of my engine and the slow creaking of the truck over uneven ground. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall, dark pines. It was smaller than I remembered, a single story with a metal roof, faded red siding, and a crooked porch. One of the steps looked half-rotten, and the windows were covered in dust. I parked near a pile of old firewood and stepped out, the air immediately colder here than it had been down in the valley. Scout jumped out beside me, sniffing the ground, his tail stiff and slow. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and mildew. Dust floated in the weak light that came through the windows. The furniture was still there. A small table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a cot against the wall. There was an old kerosene lamp sitting on the shelf, and a few cans of food that had probably been there since my uncle's time. I swept the floor, unpacked my gear, and started a small fire in the stove to warm the place up. That first night, I sat by the fire eating canned beans and bread while Scout lay near the door, ears twitching every now and then. The forest outside felt heavier than it should have. The wind pressed against the walls like something alive, and every small creak of the wood made me glance toward the dark corners of the room. I told myself it was just the quiet playing tricks on me, but when Scout lifted his head suddenly and stared toward the back wall, I felt something cold run through my chest. He didn't bark, just stared, tense, then eventually settled down again. The next morning, I decided to check around the property. The air was crisp, and frost covered the grass in a thin white layer. Behind the cabin, about 30 yards away, there was an old shed with half the roof caved in. I pushed the door open, and it groaned against the hinges. Inside were rusty tools, a broken lantern, and a few cracked jars. Mice had nested in an old sack of flour. In one corner, though, I noticed something strange: boot prints, fresh ones. They cut through the dust, leading in and out of the shed. At first, I thought they might have been mine from the day before, but they were larger, deeper. Someone else had been there recently. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared near the edge of the trees. I looked around, feeling the quiet press in again. Scout paced near me, sniffing the air, his tail lowered. I told myself it could have been a hunter passing through. Still, I kept an eye on the tree line all the way back to the cabin. That night, I bolted the door and kept the fire going longer than I needed to. I could hear small cracks outside every now and then, branches snapping, leaves rustling. It's normal for the forest to move, but this sounded deliberate, slow, like footsteps dragging through the dirt. I didn't move from the chair. Scout was up again, staring at the window. He gave a low growl this time, barely audible, but it made the hairs on my neck rise. I turned down the lamp and sat in the dark, listening. The sounds stopped after a while. I forced myself to lie on the cot, though I didn't sleep much. Every hour or so, I'd open my eyes to the faint glow from the stove and listen for any sound outside. Once, near dawn, I thought I heard something metallic hit the porch, like the dull ring of a can or a tool being dropped. But by morning, everything looked the same. On the third day, I went down toward the small creek that ran behind the hill. The sky was low and gray, and the air smelled like rain. I noticed something new near the water. Another set of prints, larger, with deep heel marks like someone carrying weight. They weren't old. I crouched down to look closer, and Scout began to bark suddenly, facing the trees. It wasn't his usual bark. It was sharp, panicked. I turned, scanning the forest, but there was nothing. Just the sway of trees and the slow rush of the creek. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed one of my truck's side mirrors was bent. It wasn't like that before. I checked the ground around it and saw faint impressions of boots again. I looked toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, keeping the lantern off. I figured if someone was out there, I didn't want to make myself visible. I sat in a chair near the window, Scout at my feet, both of us listening. Hours passed in silence until I heard the sound again. Slow steps on the porch. The boards creaked, one after another, stopping near the door. I held my breath. The door rattled, once softly, like someone testing the lock, then nothing. After a few minutes, I heard the steps retreat into the woods. At sunrise, I walked outside and saw fresh boot marks in the dirt by the porch. Whoever it was had stood right there, maybe for minutes. I felt sick. My mind ran through every possibility. A lost hiker, a squatter, someone passing through. But none of it felt right. Whoever it was didn't knock. They just stood there. I spent the day packing my things. I didn't care that I had food left or that I'd only been there 3 days. I wanted to leave before dark. As I loaded the truck, I noticed something odd nailed to a tree near the trail. It was a piece of torn flannel fabric, red and gray, pinned there with a rusted nail. It looked deliberate, almost like a marker. I stared at it for a long time before getting in the truck. On the way down the mountain, I caught glimpses of movement in the trees. A flash of color, a shape shifting between trunks, but I never saw who or what it was. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they ached. Scout sat silent beside me the whole ride, head low, eyes fixed ahead. When I finally hit the main road and saw the first sign of a gas station miles later, I pulled over and sat for a while. My heart still wouldn't slow down. I looked at the rearview mirror again and again, half expecting to see someone walking along the road behind me. But there was nothing except miles of empty forest. I never went back to that cabin. A few months later, I heard from a ranger that someone had reported signs of an old camp near there. An abandoned tent, a fire pit, some clothes hanging in the trees. They thought it might have been someone living off the grid. Maybe that was who came by at night. Maybe they just didn't want anyone near their spot. Still, sometimes I think about those nights. The sound of the slow, careful steps on the porch. The prints leading nowhere. The silence pressing so heavy it almost felt alive. And when I do, I can still picture the cabin sitting there in that clearing, the trees closing in tighter each year, hiding it from the world. Whoever walked that porch might still be out there, waiting for another truck to find that same narrow dirt road. It was late September, the kind of time when the days still hold a bit of warmth but the nights start to bite through your clothes. I had rented an old cabin near a slow, muddy river outside a small town called Redfield, about 60 miles north of Boise. I wasn't there for vacation. I just needed space to think, to get away from the noise of everything back home. The cabin was old, probably built sometime in the 50s, with dark wood walls that smelled like damp pine and cigarettes. The front porch leaned slightly to one side, and the screen door never closed properly. I had my dog with me, a shepherd mix named Cooper. He was the kind of dog that didn't bark much unless something was really wrong, and that was one of the reasons I trusted him more than most people. The place sat maybe half a mile from the main road, down a narrow path that curved between tall pines and brush thick enough to swallow you if you stepped off it. The nearest neighbor was a mile away. It was isolated in a way that was both peaceful and unsettling. The first few days went by quietly. I spent my time fixing things around the cabin, replacing a few loose boards on the steps, sealing gaps in the windows, clearing dead branches from the roof. I cooked simple meals, sat by the river in the evenings, and listened to Cooper chase rabbits through the tall grass. But something about the place always felt slightly off. At night, when I turned off the lights, the silence pressed too close. It wasn't the kind of quiet that lets you rest. It was the kind that makes every little sound, every creak, every drip of water feel deliberate. On the fourth night, I noticed something strange. I had gone out to bring in some firewood before dark and saw deep tire tracks in the mud just past the tree line, about 20 yards from the cabin. I hadn't heard a vehicle come through, and I knew the road ended before reaching that spot. The tracks were fresh, maybe an hour old, and there were boot prints beside them, large ones, pressed deep into the soft earth. It looked like someone had stopped, walked a few steps toward the cabin, then turned back. I didn't sleep much that night. Cooper kept pacing, his ears twitching, his head snapping toward the window every few minutes. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. Not an animal. A heavy, slow crunch of footsteps circling the cabin. I lay still in bed, every nerve in my body awake. The steps moved past the front porch, around to the back door, and then stopped. Cooper stood at the edge of the bed, staring toward the sound, his fur raised along his spine. I didn't move until sunrise. When I finally stepped outside, there were new footprints in the dirt by the back door. Same boots as before, deep and heavy. I followed them to the tree line, but they disappeared near the tire marks from the previous day. I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone who'd gotten lost, but that didn't sit right. No one hunts that close to private land, and no one just walks circles around a cabin at night. By the 6th day, I started noticing other little things. The shed behind the cabin had an old padlock when I arrived. I never touched it, but that morning it was hanging open. Inside were some rusted tools, old fuel cans, and a half-rotted workbench. The air smelled like gasoline and mold. What bothered me wasn't the mess. It was the fact that someone had clearly been in there recently. A fresh footprint in the dust. A broken piece of rope near the door that hadn't been there before. That night, I set up a lantern near the window and kept an old hatchet within reach. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard a truck engine somewhere in the woods, far away but slowly getting closer. The sound came down the dirt path, stopped for a few seconds, then backed away. I killed the lantern and sat in the dark, listening to my own heartbeat. Cooper growled low, barely audible, staring at the window. I didn't hear the truck again. In the morning, I walked the path out toward the main road. About a quarter mile from the cabin, I found a pile of cigarette butts near a fallen log. They were fresh, still smelling like smoke. Someone had been sitting there, watching. From that angle, you could see the cabin clearly through the trees. I felt watched all day. I tried to shake it off, but every sound, a snapping twig, the caw of a crow, even the wind, made me turn my head. Around dusk, I went down to the river to fill a bucket with water, and that's when I saw it. A small piece of torn fabric caught on a branch, right at the edge of the riverbank. It was dark blue, maybe from a jacket. When I pulled it free, I noticed a smear of dried mud mixed with something darker. I told myself it was just dirt, but I didn't believe that. I decided that if I saw any more signs of someone around, I'd leave. The next night settled in cold and still. I barricaded the doors, turned off every light, and sat by the window with my flashlight off, watching the tree line. Hours went by. The moon climbed high and silver over the river, and for a while it was quiet enough that I thought maybe it was finally over. Then Cooper started to growl again, deeper this time, more urgent. His head turned toward the back door. A second later, I heard it, the crunch of gravel. Someone was standing right outside. I could make out the faint shadow of boots through the bottom gap of the doorframe. They didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, the handle turned. It stopped against the lock. There was a pause, then the soft scrape of metal, like someone testing it with a knife or a screwdriver. Cooper barked, one loud, sharp sound that broke the silence. The footsteps backed away, slow at first, then faster. I ran to the window in time to see a figure moving through the trees. A man, tall, wearing a hood or hat, blending into the dark. I couldn't make out his face. By dawn, I packed what I could fit into my truck. Before leaving, I noticed something new on the porch, a small metal tag, the kind used for hunting dogs. It was old, scratched, and had no name on it, just a number. I'd never seen it before. I didn't touch it. I drove straight into Redfield, stopped at the small gas station on the main road, and asked the clerk if anyone had been up by the river recently. He said not many people go that way anymore since the old bridge washed out a few years back. When I mentioned the tire tracks, he said there used to be a guy who lived near that area, a trapper or something, but he disappeared years ago. They never found him. I didn't go back to the cabin after that. A week later, when I called the rental office to tell them what happened, the woman on the phone said no one had rented that property for months before me. When I gave her the address, She paused for a long time and said that cabin had been taken off their listings last year after an incident. She didn't say what it was. Sometimes I still think about that place. The smell of damp wood, the quiet river, the sound of the footsteps circling the cabin in the dark. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know they were watching. The tire marks, the footprints, the torn fabric, the open shed. It all fits together in a way that feels too close to being hunted. The cabin's probably still there, half rotted and sinking into the dirt by the riverbend. Maybe someone else will rent it someday. Maybe they'll fix it up. Maybe they'll ignore the feeling that someone's still out there in the trees watching from the shadows. But I know better. When I close my eyes at night, I still hear the crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside the door. Slow, patient, waiting for me to fall asleep. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to take a short trip out to a small cabin I'd been fixing up in northern Montana. The place sat deep in the woods, about 30 miles from the nearest town, tucked between tall pines and rough dirt roads that almost no one used anymore. I had been going there on and off for months, trying to turn the old hunting cabin into a quiet spot where I could get away from everything for a few days at a time. My dog, a brown lab mix named Cooper, always came with me. He was 8 years old back then, strong and calm, the kind of dog that made you feel safe even when you were completely alone. The drive took most of the afternoon. The weather had been gray all day, with light drizzle tapping against the windshield and fog hanging low over the highway. By the time I reached the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, it was already getting dark. The road twisted and dipped, the forest on both sides thick and quiet, like it was swallowing all sound. I remember rolling the windows up because the smell of wet leaves and damp earth was heavy, almost sour. Cooper stayed curled up on the seat beside me, but his ears were up. He always knew when we were getting close. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, the rain had stopped, but the air was cold and still. The cabin looked the same as I'd left it weeks before. Small, one-story, with a slanted tin roof and a porch that leaned slightly to one side. I noticed new scratches on the wooden door, long and deep, but I figured they were from an animal. Bears sometimes wandered close to the area looking for food. I had installed a latch high on the door for that reason. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and smoke from the last fire I'd made in the stove. I unpacked my bag, lit a small lamp, and set out Cooper's blanket near the corner. He sniffed around for a bit, tail low, before lying down. I didn't think much of it. Dogs always act a little strange in new smells. That night, after cooking a small meal on the propane stove, I sat at the old wooden table and listened to the forest through the walls. The wind had picked up, pushing branches against the roof. I could hear something creaking near the back of the cabin every now and then, probably the loose gutter I'd meant to fix. I kept telling myself it was just the wind. Still, I noticed Cooper's head kept lifting every few minutes, his ears pointing toward the window. When I stepped outside later to put away some trash, the air was colder than before. My breath came out in clouds. The trees stood still, and everything around me looked darker than usual, like the night had gotten thicker. I didn't hear any animals, no crickets, no owls, nothing, just silence. I threw the trash into a metal bin near the shed and walked back toward the cabin, my flashlight beam shaking a little in my hand. That's when I noticed something strange in the mud near the steps. Footprints, human ones, large and fresh, pressed deep into the ground. They weren't mine. I hadn't been around the back of the cabin since arriving, and these prints came from that direction, stopping right at the steps. I followed them with the flashlight until they disappeared into the woods behind the cabin. I felt a sharp chill run through my chest. I went inside and locked the door. Cooper stood near the window, staring out. His fur was raised along his back. I turned off the lamp and sat for a while, listening. The sound of the wind was gone now. The forest was completely still again. I waited for what felt like an hour before finally getting up to check the door a second time. It was locked tight. Still, I barely slept that night. I woke around 4 a.m. to a dull thud outside, like something heavy bumping against the wall. Cooper jumped up, growling low, not barking, just this deep rumble in his throat. I sat up and listened. Another sound, slow, scraping against the outer boards. My hands were shaking. I grabbed the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on right away. I waited, counting in my head, trying to decide if it was an animal or something else. The scraping moved toward the window, and I finally switched on the light. The sound stopped instantly. I stared at the window, waiting, my heart pounding. Cooper stood beside me, muscles stiff, staring too. I didn't see anything outside, just the faint reflection of the lamp and the dark shape of the trees. When daylight finally came, I went out to look. The ground under the window had deep marks, boot prints again, the same kind as before. Whoever it was had been standing right under the window for a while. I saw where the mud was disturbed, like they'd moved around, pacing. I checked the shed and around the cabin, but nothing was missing. The forest behind looked quiet, untouched, like nothing had happened. I thought about leaving right then, but I told myself it could have been someone hunting nearby. Maybe lost, maybe curious. But deep down, I knew it didn't feel right. The prints were too close. Whoever it was had been watching. That evening, I decided to stay one more night, just to see if anything else happened. I set a metal bar across the door handle and kept the flashlight beside me. I even left an empty beer bottle on the window ledge, a small trick I used so I'd hear it if someone tried to move the window from outside. The night was colder than before. Cooper barely moved from his spot near the bed. Around midnight, I heard faint steps outside again. Slow, careful, moving along the side of the cabin. My heart started racing, and I could hear my pulse in my ears. The steps stopped near the back wall. Then silence. I held my breath and waited. A few minutes later, the sound came again, this time from the porch. The wood creaked. I could tell someone was standing just on the other side of the door. The beer bottle rattled slightly on the window ledge, and Cooper growled so deep it vibrated the air. Then, without warning, something hit the door. Not hard, but enough to make the hinges shake. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the door, waiting for a shadow, a face, anything. But there was nothing after that. No more sounds. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I opened the door slowly, ready to see something. There were boot prints again, leading down the steps and into the woods. This time, they were joined by tire tracks that ended just a few feet away from the cabin. I could tell by the deep impressions that the vehicle had been parked there for a while, maybe hours. I followed the tracks down the trail until they turned off near the tree line. Whoever it was had come prepared. That was enough for me. I packed my things fast, threw everything into the truck, and didn't even bother checking the back shed again. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. Cooper sat up the whole drive back, staring out the window, ears still alert. When I got home later that day, I called a friend who worked for the Forest Service. He said there had been reports of someone breaking into cabins in that area, stealing tools, food, sometimes just watching people. They never caught him, but campers had seen a man walking alone at night near those woods. He'd vanish before anyone could get close. I never went back to that cabin again. I sold the land a year later and never even picked up the rest of my things. But I still remember those footprints, how fresh they looked in the mud, how close they came to the window, and how quiet everything felt when I realized someone had been standing there, just watching. Sometimes when I take Cooper out for a walk on cold nights, I still think about that place. The silence of the forest, the way the wind sounded before it all stopped, and that moment when I knew for sure that someone had been right outside while I slept. It wasn't a ghost or some story I made up. It was real. Someone had been there, and for all I know, they might still be out there, walking those woods, waiting for another cabin light to come on. It had been raining since morning, the kind of steady, cold rain that didn't come down in sheets but never seemed to stop either. It soaked everything: trees, soil, clothes, even sound. I could barely hear the forest anymore, just the constant hiss of water hitting leaves. My truck had gotten stuck earlier in the mud, and after 2 hours of trying to push it free, I gave up. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no cell service. My plan had been simple: to spend a few days alone, building a small cabin on a piece of land I'd bought near the northern edge of Vermont. I wasn't expecting company, and I wasn't expecting the weather to turn this bad. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to build, my boots were caked with mud and my jacket was soaked through. The rain had turned the ground into a cold sponge. I dropped my backpack near a tree stump and stood there for a moment, just breathing and looking around. The forest was thick, full of tall pines and dark undergrowth. My idea was to start with something small, maybe just a single-room cabin for hunting trips or quiet weekends. I had brought basic tools: an axe, a handsaw, a hammer, a few nails, and a tarp. I didn't plan to finish it all in one night, obviously, but I needed shelter before dark. The rain made everything harder. I began cutting down a few smaller trees nearby. The thud of the axe echoed between the wet trunks. Each swing was heavy. The wood was slick with rain, and I could feel the handle slipping in my gloves. I worked without thinking much, just trying to get enough logs together to make something temporary, a lean-to, maybe. My body ached, but I kept going. The rain mixed with sweat, running into my eyes. I couldn't tell what time it was, but the sky was turning darker fast. The forest went from dull gray to deep blue, and the air started to feel colder. When I stopped to take a break, I realized how quiet it had gotten. The rain was still falling, but softer now. There were no birds, no wind, just that faint dripping sound that happens when everything's soaked. I looked around the clearing. My tools were lying scattered around. A few planks, a half-built frame of logs, a blue tarp hanging loosely from one side. It didn't look like much, but it was something. I figured I could finish the roof later. I just needed a dry corner to sleep in. I set up a small fire pit using dry sticks I'd kept inside a plastic bag. It took a long time to get it going. The damp air made it nearly impossible. When the first bit of flame finally caught, it felt like warmth returning to my bones. I crouched near it, trying to dry my hands, but the smoke stung my eyes. The light flickered across the trees, showing shapes and shadows that kept changing with the movement of the fire. I caught myself glancing around often. The woods looked different at night, and there was a strange heaviness in the air, like the whole forest was listening. After eating a granola bar and half a can of beans, I decided to lie down under the tarp. I wrapped myself in my jacket and a thin blanket, but it didn't do much against the dampness. I could hear the rain hitting the tarp above me. Steady, constant. Every few minutes, I'd hear something else too. A faint crack of a branch or a soft thump, like footsteps in the mud. At first, I told myself it was just water or maybe a deer, but the sounds kept coming, slow and uneven. I tried to ignore it, but my body wouldn't relax. The fire outside had died down to glowing coals, and the forest had gone almost pitch black. My breathing sounded too loud. The air was cold against my face. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A soft drag through the mud. Then a faint metallic sound, like something brushing against metal. My shovel, maybe? I froze, eyes open in the dark. I waited for another sound, but everything went silent again. After a while, I forced myself up. I didn't want to, but the not knowing was worse. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out from under the tarp. The beam cut through the misty air in a narrow path. The rain had almost stopped now, just drops slipping from the trees. My tools were still there, the axe, the hammer, the saw, all lying where I'd left them. The ground was full of footprints, but most of them were mine, smeared from all the mud. Still, something felt off. I walked a slow circle around the clearing, shining the light into the woods. The trees swayed gently, dark and wet, and I could hear the faint creaking of trunks rubbing together. When I turned back toward the fire pit, I saw it. The shovel was lying a few feet from where it had been. It wasn't much, but I knew exactly where I'd left it before lying down. Now it was dragged closer to the fire pit, and there was a long streak of mud behind it. I just stared at it, my pulse starting to pound. There was no wind strong enough to move that heavy shovel. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone, but I suddenly felt the kind of alertness you get when you know you're not alone. I crouched down, turned off the flashlight for a moment, and listened. Nothing but dripping rain and distant thunder. I kept still for maybe 5 minutes, watching the edges of the clearing. I thought about packing up and leaving, but where would I go? The truck was stuck miles back, and the woods were flooded with mud. I decided to rebuild the fire to keep the area bright. I fed it with damp branches and bark until the flames rose again, throwing orange light around the clearing. I sat near it, holding the axe across my lap. My clothes were still wet, and I was shaking, though not entirely from the cold. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed sitting up, staring into the trees, every sound making my head jerk toward it. Around dawn, the rain finally stopped. The light came slowly through the fog. Everything was gray and quiet again. My tarp was half collapsed, and my tools were covered in mud. I looked at the shovel first. It was now resting near the fire, like it had been used. I walked closer and saw a small hole in the ground beside it, shallow but clearly dug during the night. It wasn't there before, just a few inches deep, like someone had started digging and stopped halfway. My stomach turned. I didn't think. I packed my things, grabbed what I could carry, and left. I didn't even bother taking the tarp down. I just started walking toward where I thought the road was, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched the entire way out. Took me almost 5 hours to find the main road again. When I finally got there, covered in mud and shaking from exhaustion, the rain started again, soft and cold. I flagged down a passing pickup, and the driver dropped me near a gas station about 10 miles away. A few days later, when the weather cleared, I came back with a tow truck to get my vehicle. I didn't go near the clearing at first, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked in through the same muddy path, stepping carefully over roots and puddles. The clearing looked almost untouched. My tarp was torn, and the logs I'd cut were scattered around. The hole near the fire pit was still there, only now it was filled halfway with rainwater. It wasn't big, just enough for someone to hide something small. I stood there for a while, staring at it, trying to figure out why anyone would dig that in the middle of nowhere. I never found out. I never built the cabin either. I sold the land a month later to a retired couple who planned to turn it into a campsite. I didn't tell them about that night. I just wanted to forget it. But sometimes, when it rains late at night and I hear that steady tapping on my window, I think about that clearing, that half-dug hole, and the sound of something dragging in the mud outside the tarp. It's been 3 years now, and I've never gone back into those woods. And I still don't know if I was truly alone that night. It was October of 2011 when I was working as a park ranger in northern Montana, near the edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. The area stretched for miles. Dense pine forests, steep ridges, cold streams, and valleys where the fog seemed to sit heavy even at noon. I had been stationed there for about 8 months, assigned to a small ranger cabin deep inside the park. It wasn't much. A single-room structure built in the 1960s, made of old timber that smelled of pine and damp rot. There was a cot, a small desk, a wood stove, and a radio that rarely picked up anything but static. The closest station was 40 miles away, and the only road that led there was barely a road at all, mostly gravel and mud. I was used to the silence. You either learned to enjoy it or you left the job. My main duties were to keep watch over the trails, check for illegal hunting, and monitor wildlife. The area was known for grisly sightings, and occasionally hikers went missing. Usually, it turned out they got lost or underestimated the terrain. Still, there was something about the forest that always felt slightly uneasy, like it was watching you back. That October, things started to get strange. It began with small things. Tracks I couldn't place, noises at night that didn't fit the usual pattern. I knew what elk sounded like, what bears sounded like, even the difference between a mountain lion and a coyote. But this was different. It wasn't an animal moving through the brush. It was something heavier, slower, deliberate. The first time I heard it, I thought maybe someone was trespassing. It was around midnight, a cold, moonless night. I was sitting by the stove, writing down patrol notes when I heard the crunch of snow outside. 2 steps, maybe 3, then silence. I froze and listened. The cabin was dead quiet except for the faint ticking of the stove as the metal cooled. Then came another sound, a slow dragging noise, like someone pulling something heavy across the ground. It circled halfway around the cabin, then stopped. I waited a long time before grabbing my flashlight and stepping outside. The air was sharp and smelled of pine and frost. I swept the beam around but saw nothing except a few thin animal tracks near the edge of the trees. The forest was pitch black beyond that. I walked a few steps out, my boots crunching on the frozen ground, and scanned the area. The sound had completely stopped. Nothing moved. The air was too still. After a few minutes, I went back inside, locked the door, and stayed up the rest of the night, listening. The next morning, I found prints leading away from the cabin. They weren't animal prints, not exactly human either. They were wide and uneven, like someone walking barefoot but with one foot dragging. The trail went into the trees and disappeared near a stream. I noted it down in my report but didn't mention it to anyone. Out there, you learned not to sound paranoid. A few days later, while on patrol near the Southern Trail, I came across something odd. A tent, torn in half, and a campsite that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There was a half-eaten can of beans, a sleeping bag ripped open, and clothes scattered. No sign of anyone around. The ground was covered in frost, so it had to be there at least overnight. I searched the perimeter and found more of those same strange footprints, leading deeper into the woods. They went on for about 50 yards before fading into a marshy patch where the ground turned to mud. I radioed it in, but the signal was weak, and I wasn't sure if anyone heard me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind pushed against the cabin walls, making them creak, and I could hear branches scratching the roof. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of movement again. Slow, steady steps right outside the window. The flashlight was beside my bed, and I gripped it tightly, staring toward the small square of glass where the moonlight seeped in. The steps stopped, then something brushed against the side of the cabin, dragging along the wood. My stomach sank. I didn't go outside that time. I sat still for what felt like hours until the sound faded away. In the morning, I checked the wall, fresh scrape marks along the boards, and one small piece of torn fabric caught on a nail. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve, dark green, old. A week passed. The weather turned colder. Snow began to fall, covering the ground and burying the tracks I had been seeing. I started feeling trapped in that little cabin. Every sound became louder. Every gust of wind made me flinch. I tried to focus on my duties, kept writing reports, kept walking the trails, but something in my gut told me to leave. The feeling of being watched was constant now. Then one morning, I found something near the stream, a boot. It was half frozen in the mud, worn down and covered in ice. Inside it was part of a foot, pale and bloated. I stood there for a long time staring at it, the sound of the wind whistling through the trees. The boot was the same size as mine. I followed the stream further, and after about 50 yards, I saw something tangled in the brush, what looked like a torn jacket sleeve, the same dark green fabric. I went back to the cabin and tried the radio again. Static. I climbed the ridge behind the cabin to get better reception, but the battery was dying, and all I caught was bits of garbled noise. I started packing my things that afternoon. I didn't care about the end of my shift or the report. I just wanted to get out. As I loaded my backpack, I noticed something on the window, a single handprint. It wasn't from me, the fingers were longer, the shape wider, pressed from the outside. It wasn't frozen. It was damp, as if someone had placed it there moments before. I looked out but saw nothing except snow falling through the trees. I locked the cabin and began the hike down the main trail. The snow was deep, and the wind cut through my jacket. After about an hour, I reached the old Ranger Supply shed about 2 miles south. I planned to rest there for a bit, maybe get a fire going before heading on. When I opened the door, I froze. Inside, against the far wall, was a pile of clothes and gear, some old, some new. I recognized the torn tent fabric, the same beans can, and the same dark green jacket sleeve. The smell inside was sour, heavy with decay. I backed out slowly, heart pounding. I didn't want to see what was under that pile. I just kept walking. For the next 5 miles, I didn't look back once. By dusk, I reached the ranger station. My truck was parked outside, half buried in snow. I drove straight into town, hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone exactly what I saw, just that I found signs of a missing camper. When search teams went out a few days later, they reported finding nothing but the torn campsite. No bodies, no prints. I quit the ranger service 2 weeks after that. I told them I needed a break, maybe a change of scenery. I moved south, took a job near a smaller park where the land was flatter and the trees didn't press so close together. Sometimes, though, when I'm out walking in the woods, I'll stop and listen to the quiet. It's a different forest, a different state, but when the wind moves through the pines just right, it sounds like slow footsteps circling somewhere behind me. And I never stay out there after dark anymore. Not after Montana. It was the first week of November, 2016. I had driven deep into the northern woods of Montana for a hunting trip I had planned for months. The cabin I was staying in wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place built by an old trapper decades ago. It sat on the edge of a frozen lake surrounded by black pines that looked darker than the night itself. The drive there had taken almost 5 hours from the nearest town, and by the time I arrived, the sky had already turned gray, with the kind of cold that seeps through your clothes no matter how many layers you wear. The cabin was about 30 feet from the tree line, and behind it, a steep hill went up into the woods. Inside, there was one bed, a rusted stove, a small table, and a window that faced the lake. The walls were rough, made of thick logs that had turned almost silver from age. I could smell the dampness inside, like wet wood mixed with dust. The wind whistled through small cracks in the wall, and every time it did, I could feel the chill crawling down my back. I was alone, which was how I liked it. Hunting was something I did more for the silence than the sport. The world got too loud, too crowded, and a few days alone in the woods always cleared my head. That first night, I built a fire in the stove, made some Ken stew, and went over my gear: a .308 rifle, binoculars, hunting knife, a flashlight, and a small pack with the essentials. I slept early, the kind of deep sleep that comes only after a long day of travel. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. My breath came out in clouds, and the cabin was colder than a fridge. I could see the frost forming on the inside of the window. I dressed in thick gear, loaded my rifle, and stepped outside. The air was so still that every crunch of snow under my boots echoed far. I could hear the creaking of frozen trees somewhere in the distance. I followed a trail that led up behind the cabin into the woods. The snow was light but crusty, and I could see old tracks. Deer, maybe elk, but nothing fresh. After about an hour of hiking, I reached a small ridge overlooking a frozen creek. I stayed there for a while, glassing the area, but saw nothing. The forest felt oddly empty, as if the wildlife had moved on days ago. As I started heading back, I noticed something strange. About 100 yards to my right, near the tree line, there were footprints, human footprints. They were deep, clear, and recent. No other vehicle had been down that old dirt road except mine, and I hadn't seen anyone since I left town. The prints were from heavy boots, maybe work boots or hiking ones, and they went off into the woods away from my cabin. I told myself maybe another hunter had passed through, though I hadn't seen any signs of another camp. Still, the prints looked fresh enough that whoever made them couldn't have been more than an hour ahead of me. I followed them for about 50 yards before they faded where the snow thinned. I turned back, uneasy but trying not to think much of it. By late afternoon, I was back at the cabin. I cleaned my rifle, made coffee, and tried to shake the feeling that someone else was nearby. The forest had gone eerily quiet again, and that stillness started to feel heavier, like the woods were listening. As the light faded, I gathered extra firewood from behind the cabin. That's when I saw something else. Near the edge of the tree-line, I spotted a small piece of orange fabric caught on a branch. When I went closer, I saw it was part of a hunting jacket, torn, dirty, and stiff with ice. There were no signs of anyone around, but the snow beneath it was disturbed, as if someone had been standing there not too long ago. I picked up the fabric, turned it over in my glove, and saw what looked like a few dark stains frozen into it. I left it where it was and went inside. The rest of the evening dragged on slow. I couldn't stop glancing at the window facing the woods. The night had gone darker than usual, the kind of dark that swallows the outlines of the trees completely. The wind had picked up, too, rattling the metal latch on the door now and then. Around 10, I turned off the lantern and tried to sleep, but something felt wrong. I could hear faint noises outside, soft crunching, not wind, not branches snapping, just a slow, steady movement in the snow. I held my breath and listened harder. It stopped, then started again, closer this time, circling toward the back of the cabin. My hand went to the rifle beside the bed. Minutes passed, maybe more, then silence again. I told myself it was probably an animal, a fox or coyote, but something deep inside didn't believe that. The steps had been too measured, too human. When I finally drifted into sleep, it was light and uneasy. At some point in the night, I woke to a faint scraping sound against the wall. Not loud, just a slow drag, like someone running their hand or something along the logs. I lay perfectly still, heart pounding, trying to tell if it was real or a dream. The scraping stopped after a while, and I didn't move until the gray light of morning came through the window. The next day, I checked outside. I found what I was hoping I wouldn't. Footprints again, right behind the cabin, just under the window where I had slept. They were the same kind of boot prints I'd seen before, leading back into the woods. I followed them a short way until they disappeared into a thick patch of trees. I didn't see or hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I stayed close to the cabin that day, gathering firewood and checking my gear. Every sound made me tense. The wind through the trees started to sound like whispers. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet. Around dusk, I noticed something else. an old, half-rotted deer carcass not far from the treeline. It hadn't been shot or hunted. It looked like it had been dragged there. The snow around it was trampled by footprints, human, not animal. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the lantern on low, rifle across my lap, listening. Around midnight, the noises came again, this time from the front of the cabin. Slow steps in the snow, stopping and starting, then silence. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The air felt thick, hard to breathe. After what felt like an hour, I heard something metallic, maybe the latch on the door moving slightly. I stayed perfectly still. It didn't open, but I knew whoever was out there was close enough to touch that handle. I waited until the first sign of dawn before moving. By morning, the tracks were there again, circling the cabin this time, then heading off toward the woods. My hands were shaking when I locked up the door and packed my things. I didn't even finish breakfast. I loaded everything into my truck and started the engine, my eyes scanning the treeline constantly. As I drove down the dirt road, I saw something in the distance, a shape standing near the bend of the road, partly hidden by the trees. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes and no visible gear. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching my truck approach. I didn't slow down. As I got closer, I realized his face was covered by a hood, and his hands were hanging by his sides. I kept my eyes forward, my foot pressing harder on the gas until he was gone in the rearview mirror. When I reached the main road 2 hours later, I finally stopped to breathe. My hands were still shaking. I looked back once more down that long, empty dirt road. Just trees, wind, and white silence. I never went back to that cabin again. A few weeks later, when I called the owner to tell him I was done renting it, he mentioned something that stuck with me. He said that years ago, a hunter had gone missing not far from there. They never found him, only his torn jacket and boot prints circling a cabin near the lake. I didn't tell him I knew exactly where that was. It was late October 2017 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small cabin my uncle used to own in northern Montana. He'd sold it years back, but the new owner let me use it for a weekend since I wanted to get away from the noise of the city. I just turned 34, recently gone through a breakup, and I felt like I needed a place with silence, trees, and air that didn't smell like gasoline. The cabin sat deep in a wooded area, about 5 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by pine trees that grew so thick you could barely see 10 feet through them. I left my truck parked beside a gravel path that ran beside the cabin. It wasn't big, one small bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a short porch that looked out into the forest. There was no phone signal, no internet, and no one around for miles. I brought enough food, a generator, and some basic tools in case anything broke. It was cold that evening, somewhere near freezing, and by the time I finished unloading, it was already getting dark. The woods out there had this heavy silence, like the air itself pressed down on you. Even the wind felt quiet. When I walked around the cabin, my boots sank slightly into the damp ground, and I could hear the crunch of old pine needles under every step. The cabin creaked every few seconds, like it was breathing. That first night was calm. I heated a can of soup, turned on the generator for a bit of light, and sat near the window looking into the forest. The moonlight reflected off the frost that had started forming on the grass. There wasn't a sound outside, no owls, no insects, nothing. Just the low hum of the generator in the distance. It made me uneasy, but I told myself that's just how deep forests sound. Around midnight, I turned off the generator and went to bed. I left the lantern on the table beside me, flickering dimly. I remember hearing a soft sound outside the window, like footsteps on wet leaves. They were slow, spaced apart, like someone taking careful steps. I thought maybe it was a deer. I tried not to think much of it, rolled over, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I went outside to check the noise. The ground was covered with frost and damp pine needles. A few yards away from the porch, I noticed what looked like shoe prints. They weren't animal tracks, they were too wide, and the pattern looked like rubber soles. The steps came from the direction of the woods, circled around the cabin once, then disappeared back toward the trees. My stomach turned a bit. I kept staring at those prints, thinking maybe a hunter had passed through during the night, or maybe some hiker got lost. But the closest trail was about 4 miles away, and no one in their right mind would be out there at midnight in that cold. I brushed it off, though I kept glancing at the tree line every few minutes while I made breakfast. I noticed something strange about the prints. They were uneven, like whoever made them was limping or dragging one leg slightly. By afternoon, clouds rolled in. The wind started to pick up, and the woods got darker. I decided to chop some wood for the night since the temperature was dropping fast. Every time the axe hit the log, the echo bounced between the trees, and it felt like someone might be standing just out of sight. I couldn't shake that feeling, that weight on my neck like eyes were fixed on me from somewhere deep in the woods. When night came again, I kept the lanterns on longer than I needed to. The generator's noise made me feel a bit safer, like the sound filled up the empty silence. But around 11 p.m., I went to turn it off to save fuel. The moment the generator went quiet, the woods came alive with that same heavy stillness. It was so silent it almost rang in my ears. I sat in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Then I heard it again, those steps, this time closer, softer, moving slow, circling the cabin again. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound went from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped near the back door. I waited, frozen. After what felt like forever, I heard a faint scraping noise, like something being dragged along the wooden siding of the cabin. It went from one corner to the other, then stopped. I stayed awake until morning, gripping the flashlight so tight my hand went numb. When sunlight finally came through the window, I went outside to look again. The ground was covered in new prints. They circled the cabin again, and this time they were closer together, like whoever it was had been pacing. The marks by the wall showed where something sharp had scraped against the wood, maybe a stick or a metal rod. I followed the tracks for a few feet into the trees before they faded into the pine needles. That day, I decided I'd leave the next morning. I packed most of my things, just left enough out to last the night. But as evening came, I couldn't shake the thought that whoever or whatever had been out there might come again. I stacked a chair under the door handle, locked the windows, and kept the lantern burning through the night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a dull thud. It wasn't loud, just enough to snap me out of sleep. Then another one. The sound came from the back wall, like someone lightly hitting the wood. Then came the dragging noise again, slow and deliberate. My throat went dry. I stayed completely still, listening. The scraping stopped. A few seconds later, I heard soft, uneven footsteps move toward the front porch. They stopped right outside the door. The old wood creaked under the weight of each step. Then silence. The kind of silence that makes your heart pound so hard you can hear it. I sat there for at least half an hour, not moving, barely breathing. Eventually, I heard the steps fade away, moving back into the woods. When the first bit of daylight showed, I didn't waste time. I threw everything in the truck and started it up, hands shaking. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw it, by the edge of the tree line, maybe 20 yards away. Person standing there. They were wearing a dark jacket, torn at one sleeve, and something was off about the way they stood. Their head tilted slightly, one shoulder higher than the other. I couldn't make out the face, but I saw their leg, bent wrong, like it had been broken and never healed right. They didn't move, just stood there watching as I drove off. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. When I finally looked back, the figure was gone. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I called the owner of the cabin and told him about what I'd seen. He said a few years ago, a man had gone missing in those woods. He'd been hiking alone, supposedly got lost in the early winter and never made it out. They found some of his gear a few miles north of the cabin, but never his body. That stuck with me. I kept wondering if maybe that person I saw wasn't someone wandering. Maybe it was someone who never really left those woods at all. Not a ghost, not some story. Just a man who'd lost his mind out there, surviving off whatever he could find, watching anyone who came close. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see that shape standing by the trees. That crooked leg, that tilt of the head. I think about how long he must have been living out there, watching that cabin night after night. And what would have happened if I hadn't left that morning. I never went back. The cabin's still there, probably rotting away, but I don't care. I can still picture those prints around the porch, deep in the frost, circling again and again like someone waiting for a door to open. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to drive up north to a small, forgotten stretch of forest in Montana. I had been working construction jobs all summer, and my body was worn down. I wanted peace, real peace, away from phones, cars, and people. I'd heard about an old trail that cut through the hills near a lake called Kepler's Hollow. A friend of mine, years ago, mentioned there were some old cabins scattered deep in those woods, left behind by logging crews sometime back in the 1960s. They were supposed to be falling apart, but I figured one might still have a roof good enough to keep the rain off for a night or two. The drive took most of the day. By the time I reached the dirt road that cut into the forest, the sun was already dipping low. The air smelled of pine sap and damp soil, and every so often, I'd catch sight of deer moving between the trees. The road narrowed the further I went, with grass growing down the middle and branches scraping across my truck sides. I drove another mile before the path became too rough to risk. I parked under a leaning pine tree and decided to walk the rest of the way with my pack. It was colder than I expected. The woods felt tight, the trees packed so close together that barely any light reached the ground. I followed what looked like an old logging trail, almost swallowed by moss and brush. My boots kept sinking into the soft earth, and I could hear the creak of branches swaying above me. After about an hour, I spotted something through the trees, a straight line that didn't belong in nature. I pushed closer and saw a shape take form through the leaves. It was a cabin. The place looked like it hadn't seen a human in decades. The walls were gray with rot, the roof sagging under the weight of years. The door hung crooked, half broken at the hinges. There was a narrow porch that tilted downward, one side swallowed by weeds. The windows were black, all covered from the inside with boards nailed unevenly. I could tell the place wasn't safe, but I was too tired to care. I figured I could stay just one night. Inside, the air was thick with that old, stale smell of mildew and wood rot. The floor creaked so loud under my boots it sounded like dry bones cracking. The front room was small. An old stove rusted in the corner, a table with one leg snapped off, and a broken chair lying on its side. There were cans on a shelf near the wall, labels faded beyond reading. A sleeping bag, torn and dirty, was bunched up near the far corner. It looked like someone had been there at some point. Not recently, but not 50 years ago either. I dropped my pack, pulled out my flashlight, and gave the place a better look. There were old footprints in the dust, leading toward a door in the back. The prints were faint, but they didn't look ancient. It was hard to tell if they belonged to boots or shoes, but the thought made me uneasy. I told myself they could have been mine when I walked in, though I knew that wasn't true. I unrolled my blanket on the driest patch of floor and started a small fire in the stove with the kindling I had packed. It took a while for the smoke to clear through the cracks in the roof, but soon it was warm enough to sit without my jacket. Outside, the woods had gone silent except for the occasional snap of branches far off. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, something faint, like a dull thud. At first, I thought it was just the wood shifting, or maybe a branch falling outside. But then it came again, slower this time, more like a heavy step. I stayed still, listening. The fire had died down to embers, and the light barely reached the walls. Another step, this one closer. It sounded like someone walking along the porch. I didn't move. I just watched the faint glow of the fire, waiting to hear something else. The boards on the porch groaned once, then stopped. I waited for what felt like forever, my ears straining against the quiet. Then I heard it again, but this time it came from the back of the cabin. A dragging sound like something being pulled across the ground. I slowly reached for my flashlight and switched it on. The beam hit the far wall. The noise stopped. My heartbeat felt like it was echoing inside my head. I listened again, but there was nothing, only the faint wind outside. I tried to calm myself down. Probably an animal, I thought. A raccoon, maybe a deer brushing past the wall. After a few minutes, I forced myself to lie back down, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The smell of the cabin was stronger now, like old metal and damp earth. It made my stomach turn. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes grew heavy again, and at some point, I drifted off. When I woke up, it was still dark, though the air felt colder. My fire had gone completely out. The air inside the cabin was freezing. I sat up, shivering, and reached for my flashlight. As soon as I turned it on, I froze. The back door was open. I knew I had shut it. It was warped and cracked, but I had pushed it closed before lying down. Now it hung wide open, swinging slightly as the wind pushed through. My throat went dry. I stood up and moved closer, the beam of my light shaking as I pointed it outside. There was nothing visible beyond the doorway, just trees and darkness. Still, I stepped outside. My breath came out in clouds. The ground behind the cabin was muddy, and there were marks in it. Not footprints exactly, just deep scuffs, like something heavy had been dragged toward the tree line. I followed the marks a few feet, my boots sinking into the soft ground. The trail ended near a thick cluster of brush. I couldn't see anything beyond that, and the air felt heavier there, colder somehow. I turned back toward the cabin, my light catching something near the wall, scratches, long and uneven, carved deep into the wood. They ran across the side of the cabin, jagged and random, some higher than my head. I didn't stay to count them. When I went back inside, I noticed something else. My backpack had been moved. I had left it near the front door, but now it was sitting closer to the stove, half open. The food I packed was gone. My knife too. The sleeping bag in the corner was also gone. Just gone. I didn't wait around to think it through. I grabbed what was left, shoved it into my pack, and stepped out into the cold morning light. The forest was silent again. Not a bird or insect in earshot. Every sound I made seemed too loud. It took me nearly 3 hours to find the main trail again. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I didn't even stop to rest. I threw my bag in the passenger seat and drove until I hit the main road, not looking back once. That night, I checked the map again, trying to find Kepler's Hollow, but I couldn't. There was no record of it on any map I looked at. Maybe the name was wrong. Maybe the place had been wiped off years ago when the logging stopped. I never went back there, and I never told anyone the full story. I still don't know what was in that cabin, or who had been there before me, but I think about those marks on the wall sometimes, those deep scratches carved by something desperate or angry. I can still hear the creak of that porch in my head when I close my eyes, that slow step that stopped right outside the door. I told myself it was an animal, that it had to be, but the thing that still bothers me most, more than the open door, more than the missing food, is that when I left, I looked back one last time through the trees. The cabin door was closed again, perfectly shut, like it had never been opened at all. It was October of 2018 when I rented a small cabin deep in the desert of northern Arizona, not far from the Navajo reservation line. I wasn't from the area, just a guy from Oregon who wanted a break from everything. My life had started to feel hollow after losing my job, and I thought a few quiet weeks alone might reset me. I found the cabin online, an old one-room wooden place with no cell service, no internet, and barely enough solar power to keep a small fridge running. It looked peaceful in the listing pictures, surrounded by red dirt, scattered junipers, and a dry riverbed not far behind it. The man who rented it out left a metal lockbox on the porch with the key, and I drove there in my old 2002 Ford Ranger, bringing only a few bags of groceries, my dog, some camping gear, and a rifle. The first few days were calm. The desert nights were cold and completely silent, except for the wind that moved through the brush like someone dragging fabric across the dirt. My dog, Max, was usually calm, but he started acting strange on the second night. He would lift his head suddenly, ears pointed toward the window, and then start growling at nothing. I'd get up, look outside, and see only the outline of the desert under the moonlight. The nearest house was about 6 miles away, and the small dirt road to the highway was rough enough that no one came out here unless they had a reason. One night, around 11, I took Max out so he could relieve himself. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale light over everything. The dry wind smelled faintly of sage and dust. Max froze near the edge of the yard, stiff as a board, staring toward the dry riverbed. His growl was low and shaky, unlike how he normally barked at animals. I followed his gaze and saw something moving near the bushes, something upright. At first, I thought it might have been a man, but the way it moved didn't make sense. It was jerky, uneven, like someone trying to remember how to walk. I called out, but my voice got swallowed by the wind. The figure paused, then slowly turned back toward the trees and disappeared. I waited a long time before going back inside. Max refused to leave the door that night. He sat there, staring through the glass until morning. I tried to shake it off the next day. Maybe it was just a local hunter or someone passing through. But the longer I stayed, the more it felt wrong. I started noticing small things, footprints around the cabin that weren't mine, and not quite shaped like boots either. The prints looked long, almost bare, with the toes pressed deep into the dust. I told myself they belonged to an animal. That made sense. But it was hard to convince myself when I started hearing footsteps around the cabin after dark. It would always start around the same time after midnight. Slow steps, circling the outside walls, sometimes stopping near the windows. Max would growl so hard his teeth chattered. I'd grab the rifle and sit up in bed, staring toward the sound. It was never fast, never running, just pacing. After 3 nights of this, I tried something. I stayed awake with all the lights off, sitting in the corner where I could see the front window. Around 1 in the morning, I saw movement outside. A shape came from behind the tree line, walking toward the porch. My heart started racing, and I held my breath. It moved closer, the figure's outline clearer in the moonlight. It looked human, but taller. Its arms seemed to hang lower than normal, and its head tilted slightly as if studying the cabin. I didn't move. I just watched. Then it made a sound. It wasn't an animal sound, and it wasn't quite human either. It was something in between, a broken, rasping noise, like someone trying to copy the sound of a voice. The noise came again, almost like the sound of my own voice calling the dog's name. Max lost it, barking so hard he slammed against the window. The thing turned suddenly, its head twitching fast, then dropped on all fours and ran off into the brush. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was thinking about leaving, but I told myself maybe I was imagining things, that being alone out there was messing with my head. The desert could play tricks on your mind: heat, silence, isolation. Still, I packed some things in case I needed to go quickly. That evening, I found something near the edge of the porch. It was one of Max's toys, the rubber ball I had thrown the day before, now split down the middle and covered in dirt. I hadn't left it out there. Something had brought it back. That was the moment the air around me changed. I can't explain it properly, but I felt watched in a way that made my skin crawl. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it was listening. That night, I sat awake again, rifle in hand, lights off. Around 2 in the morning, I heard scratching on the door. Not knocking, scratching like fingernails on wood. Then came that sound again, the broken, wrong version of my voice saying the dog's name. I felt the blood drain from my face. Max backed into the corner, his fur raised, making a low, whining noise. I didn't move. The scratching continued for what felt like forever. Then silence. After a few minutes, I slowly stood and went to the window. I lifted the curtain just enough to look outside. Under the pale moonlight, I saw something crouched near the steps of the porch. It was shaped like a man but too thin, its joints bending wrong, its skin stretched tight over bones. It looked up, and for the first time I saw its face, or what was left of one. It looked almost human, but wrong in ways I can't describe properly. The skin around the mouth looked torn, and its eyes reflected light like an animal's. I stumbled back and dropped the curtain. I waited for it to come through the door, but it didn't. When the sun came up, I walked outside slowly with the rifle. The porch was covered in tracks. Bare feet, long and narrow, with dirt and dried blood pressed into the wood. I loaded everything into the truck that morning. I didn't even bother cleaning up. As I drove away, I looked in the mirror and saw Max staring out the back window, whining softly. I could still see faint prints in the dust road behind us for a while until the wind covered them. When I reached the small town 20 miles out, I stopped at a gas station. The attendant noticed my hands shaking as I filled the tank. He asked if I was okay, but I didn't answer. That night, I booked a cheap motel room and sat awake until morning. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't done watching. For weeks after, I kept hearing that same sound in my dreams. The broken voice trying to copy mine, calling the dog's name in the dark. I never went back for the rest of my things. A few months later, the cabin listing was gone from the website. I tried to find it again, but nothing came up. No record of it, no pictures, not even the name of the man who rented it. Sometimes, late at night when the wind hits the side of my house back in Oregon, I still remember that noise outside the door and that thin shape under the moonlight. I remind myself it was probably just some kind of animal, that maybe the desert plays tricks on people who spend too long alone. But every time Max growls at the window now, I still turn off the lights, just in case.